Today I am going to provide just a brief overview of childhood trauma and why it's an important aspect of our work in treatment foster care. We're also going to talk about how understanding our children's exposure to trauma and how it's impacting them in terms of symptoms should drive how we practice as social workers. So we'll begin by talking just very briefly about what is trauma, what does it mean to be a trauma-informed system, and what are those traumatic stress reactions that we should be looking for in our children, understanding a bit more about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is a study that's really changed the landscape for how we think about trauma and its impact on the developing child. We're going to then briefly discuss how exposure to trauma impacts brain development and an overactive stress response in our children, and then move into a bit about why it's important to assess this further in our children. Just to get started, and so that we're all on the same page, I think it is important to consider what do I mean by a traumatic event. It's often thought of as child maltreatment, and for me, childhood trauma is much more broad than child maltreatment, and that's an important distinction. But a traumatic event can really be any sort of experience that threatens the life or physical integrity of the child or someone critically important to the child. For example, a parent, a sibling, a best friend. It really could be even a favorite pet. Traumatic events are generally accompanied by physiological arousal, or what we often refer to as that fight, flight, or freeze response. So what is traumatic stress as opposed to a traumatic event? Traumatic stress is really referring to the physical and emotional responses of a child to those life-threatening situations. Traumatic stress symptoms may become problematic when they begin to interfere with normal functioning and development. So most people that experience something that's incredibly scary or life-threatening are going to have some sort of traumatic stress reaction. That's very typical. For some people it will last a few hours, for some people a few days, for others maybe months, and it's critical to just note and pay attention to when it's interfering with everyday living and functioning, and at that point it's something that we need to consider in terms of more specific treatment or intervention. Most children are extremely resilient. I think that's really important to consider here. We always say it's about a third of children that will likely need additional interventions for treating traumatic stress symptoms. The one thing I would say is it's really important to consider that this is, we're serving children in the child welfare system, and by definition, they've been exposed to often multiple traumatic events, and so are certainly at an increased risk for negative outcomes as a result of this exposure early in life. I always just talk about three different types of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex. Acute trauma is, again, just a one-time incident, usually isolated in time. It's something like a car accident, being attacked by a dog, an isolated date rape, or a tornado or natural disaster of some sort. So of the three types of trauma, this type of trauma exposure is the least likely to probably cause a difficult or problematic traumatic stress reaction. Although it's entirely possible to develop full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of one of these experiences, it is the least likely to do so in comparison to chronic and complex trauma exposure. And generally we think of that as because when people are exposed to an acute trauma, usually people wrap their arms around them quickly. If there's a tornado, the community is invested, there's lots of support, safety is often restored quickly, and these are all things that help children and adults be resilient in the face of adversity or trauma exposure. Chronic trauma, on the other hand, is the experience of multiple traumatic events, often over a long period of time. So repeated physical abuse or physical abuse combined with, community violence exposure, or an assault at school of some sort. And this ups the ante for developing a negative response to trauma exposure, because each traumatic experience serves to reinforce the first traumatic experience. So a child has an experience where they're physically abused, they begin to think, adults are not safe, or when they behave, it's going to result in some sort of physical violence, and they carry those thoughts with them into everyday life. And then when they encounter another very scary thing, it reinforces all of those thoughts, like this is a scary world, adults can't be trusted, and it just increases the risk of, again, those problematic reactions. Complex trauma is a type of chronic trauma that's been much more closely studied in the last 10 to 15 years. And the reason that they distinguish this type of trauma exposure is because these children often look the most severe. So this is children who experience multiple traumatic events that begin at a very young age, often before age 5, but for many of these children it begins in infancy. And the trauma is caused by the people who are supposed to be caring for and protecting the child. When children experience this type of trauma, as I mentioned earlier, they're just at a great risk of a long-term trajectory of negative outcomes. They just tend to look more severe than other children. So just to distinguish again, you can be exposed to chronic trauma that's not complex, because it's not beginning early in childhood and it's not at the hands of your caregiver. So just to help distinguish that. Other sources of ongoing stress often compound the impact of trauma exposure for these kids. Many children, especially in the child welfare system, may be experiencing poverty, discrimination, separations from parents and siblings, frequent moves, school problems, traumatic grief and loss in the sense of, an adult caregiver that suicides, or a sibling, refugee or immigrant experiences, and incarcerated parents, all of which compound the impact of trauma exposure. So it's not likely that those of you that are listening to this video are thinking, wow, it never had dawned on me that our children that we serve at PATH are exposed to tremendous amounts of trauma. That is certainly not new. What is new is the neurobiology research that helps us understand how trauma impacts brain development and consequently behavior and emotion regulation. So this is not about suggesting a new category of disability. It's about implementing an adaptable, universal framework for addressing trauma-related challenges. So I always give the example of just as when you go to the phlebotomist puts on those rubber gloves because he or she is protecting themselves from the fact that you may have a contagious disease. Whether or not they can tell that by looking at you, they don't know. So always they put on the rubber gloves. My suggestion for PATH in terms of thinking about trauma and how we address it as an organization is the same type of metaphor. That it is always that we're putting on those gloves or those trauma lenses, our understanding about trauma and its impact on kids in everything we do, whether it's hiring, policies, working with families, working with foster parents or children or our community partners. We're always working with that kind of universal precaution of understanding trauma, because there's no risk in treating people and working from that framework, even if the child has not had that sort of trauma exposure. And the truth is, the reality is, unfortunately, we don't know and may never know the extent to which children are exposed to trauma, because they may never disclose that. So we're far better off approaching every child as if that's been their experience than treating them as if it has not been. So what do I mean by a trauma-informed system? And I think this is a big commitment on behalf of PATH to move in this direction. For me, this is an organization that has done much more than provide their staff with education about trauma. That is indeed the first step. It helps us create urgency and a need to develop a trauma-informed organization. But ultimately, this is a much bigger thing than professional development. And so I'll just read this quote from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. A trauma-informed system is one in which all parties involved recognize and respond to the impact of traumatic stress on those who have contact with the system, including children, caregivers, and service providers. Programs and agencies within such a system infuse and sustain trauma awareness, knowledge, and skills into their organizational cultures, practices, and policies. They act in collaboration with all those who are involved with the child, using the best available science to facilitate and support the recovery and resiliency of the child and the family. So you can see again, it's much more than professional development, but that it's really infusing this understanding into every aspect of our organizational culture. This is not a new program, this is not a new curriculum. I can't hand you a pamphlet on what this means for an organization. What I can say is that it mirrors well-established best